Hello, my name is Aidan Lonergan and I'm the Character and Creature Creation Tutor here at Escape Studios. In today's tutorial, we're going to be looking at how to sculpt a nose. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So just like the other tutorials in this series about sculpting facial features, we're going to start with a simple shape. In this case, we're going to start with a cube. What I'm going to do first is simply just kind of scale down the cube in kind of one direction. Again, we want to obviously make sure that our cube has kind of the appropriate length in order to create our nose, and we can kind of move forth. Again, you'll notice at the moment the cube, if I press Shift F, I can see the polygroups and the wireframe. And at the moment, it has subdivision levels, which again, when we're trying to just nail down the basic forms and shapes, we don't need this much resolution. So what I'm going to do is going into my geometry tab here, I'm going to lower down my subdivision count to 1, and I'm just going to delete higher. Now this is too low. Again, we said low is good, but sometimes you can have a situation where something is just too low resolution. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to increase this using Dynamesh. So again, under geometry, we're going to go to the Dynamesh tab, and I tend to personally like to use 32 and Dynamesh that there. So now we have a little bit of resolution to kind of begin sculpting. If you want to, you can obviously smooth it a little bit. Again, not much, but just a tad, just so we can kind of get working. Now we have our basic shape here. I've got the references of different parts of the nose in order to most accurately capture the forms and shapes that we'll see in our sculpt. Cool. So the very first thing is to obviously pull out a base shape of the nose. And again, there's different ways to do this. You can obviously just kind of using a move brush, just pull out a nose. However, if you want a little bit more control, you can obviously use a mask. So holding down control, again, we can just kind of paint in a region. That's kind of our nose. So it's kind of a triangular shape. Something like that. Of course, we can invert this. So control tap of the mesh to invert your mask. And then again, I can either press W, but again, your nose doesn't fit this profile, right? Again, as you can see, we do have kind of these sorts of angles. So instead, hit Q to go back to sculpting. I'm going to again use my move brush, a relatively large brush. Again, as we always say, big change, big brush, small change, small brush. So with our big brush, we can kind of pull out the nose and obviously start to kind of create this sort of shape. Again, you can thin it a little bit at the front as well. That's perfectly fine. Lovely. And then once you're happy kind of with the base shape, we can obviously clear the mask. The rule of thumb, or generally the rule of thumb, is that we want to work as low poly for as long as possible. So not only do we have big change, big brush, small change, small brush, we also have kind of another mantra that we kind of work by when we're sculpting, which is low and slow. So the idea that you want to stay as low poly for as long as possible. And you'll be surprised at how much detail you can actually kind of achieve at that low poly stage. So although it's very tempting to try and increase the resolution of this mesh, as of right now, we're not going to do that. So what we can do is we can start to kind of build in some of these other shapes and forms. So at the moment, I'd say the nose bridge is again a bit too wide. So in many of our references, we do have, again, the nose bridge does change width as we go down the nose. So the idea that maybe it'll start a little bit thinner at the top. Again, slightly smaller brush. Again, it might kind of get a little bit larger in the middle, so we can keep that there. And again, it will typically kind of tend to get a bit smaller towards what we call the ball of the nose, or you can see here, greater a la cartilage. We've got this nice reference for kind of underneath the nose, especially this one here. So we can kind of start to capture that. So again, we can start to kind of just push this in a little bit. Again, smaller brush to kind of round this off. So we're just kind of capturing the shapes and forms at the moment. And in a moment, we can then start to increase this. We can add nostrils now, but we can add them later, and that's also perfectly fine. And again, I'm just going to smooth, again, the transitions into our kind of cube shape. Of course, when we come to sculpting a full head, a lot of the forms from the nose will, again, come from other forms, so around the mouth and around the eyes. Obviously, they kind of interchange and play together. Obviously, for this tutorial, we're just looking at the nose by itself, but just know that it plays a greater part in the face, and obviously, all those parts speak to each other in order to kind of get a nice, smooth result. So I'm not going to increase my resolution, I'm going to keep it at 32, but I can re-Dynamesh to essentially redistribute the faces in order to kind of work on some higher changes. So you can either turn Dynamesh on and off here to get the result, or alternatively you have to undo that. When Dynamesh is orange, so again anything if it's orange in ZBrush, it just means it's on. I can just hold Control and drag, and you'll notice I can Dynamesh. So then this allows me to kind of control how things are working. So what I'm going to do at the moment is we can again start to build up the sides of the nose. So you can see we have the alar fat on the sides, or essentially your nostrils. So they have kind of very distinct plane changes. So again, for this, I'm going to use clay build-up. Again, we can start to kind of come into the sides here. Again, trying to capture that shape and form. Obviously at the front, again, it's quite a very wide nose at the moment. So again, coming from the bottom, I'm going to use a bigger move brush just to, again, push this in. So you can see the shape that I'm trying to capture. And then from the front, you can then start to see we're kind of getting a nose shape. Again, obviously, this is why I said try and make your cube as big as possible at the beginning. To obviously, it's easier to take away space than it is to create space. So we can kind of, again, just using slightly bigger brush, I'm just going to, again, using move just to kind of form the size of the nose here. So the idea that, again, we can kind of push in and build up this kind of shape. Lovely. Obviously, different people have different noses. So as you sculpt this, again, we're obviously using a mix of references. Again, this is great to have, but also look at real people and their noses and how they are different. Again, people have different nose profiles, they have kind of different nose bridges. But generally, even if the noses are different, we're still going to see the basic plane changes that we still want to have present here. So we want to capture those. Cool, so again, just a bit of smoothing, just to relax that. So as we can see from our references, we have this small bump on the nose, on the bridge of the nose, which indicates essentially where the skull stops and the nose becomes cartilage. So we have this kind of transition. So we can come in, again, usually with, say, Dam Standard, or I'm going to use the clay build-up brush in this case, just to kind of, again, knock that in a little bit. It doesn't have to be much, but we can mark it in and then just smooth it back. So even that is just kind of giving us a slight indication that it's kind of transitioning from bone to cartilage, which is, again, very important to capture as part of the nose. And again, then I might want to use my move brush just to, again, kind of pinch this in and kind of work on the form of the nose there. Obviously, what's again important is that kind of, again, underneath the nose. So we can kind of see from our references that we can see the septum underneath. So again, it doesn't kind of go straight back. There is a little bit of kind of coming downwards. So we can, again, pull our septum down, just like so. So we can kind of capture the shape. Again, a little bit of smoothing. And now what I might start to do is come in with the Dam Standard and kind of create my nostrils. Again, I like to come from the sides to begin with. So kind of just coming from the side to kind of trace that shape, but soon after, again, coming from underneath just to kind of carve out that shape. Now, again, we've got a lovely reference here. Again, you'll notice how the nostrils are shaped. Typically, what people tend to do is they kind of sculpt it right to the tip of the nose, and then obviously from the front, kind of you get some kind of weird shapes. But you'll notice that the nostrils are only going to kind of, they make up maybe 2/3 of the bottom of the nose. They don't kind of do that last third. So the idea that we can, again, use our kind of move brush to, again, bring the nostrils back. So again, they don't fill up this space. And again, we'll have a tapering of the septum as well. So again, just using my move brush, we can taper that septum, just so again, it gets thinner slightly towards the top. And we will obviously thicken this wall later when we give ourselves more mesh resolution. Again, it's important as we do this, you'll notice that we can kind of see these angles that we achieve in this nose profile. Again, as I said, different people have different noses, so obviously look at the reference that you're working with. But in our case, I would say that my nostril or my alar fat is a little bit too high at the moment, so we can kind of pull this down. So again, maybe slightly pull it down. Again, maybe it's a case of pulling this up slightly. But also importantly, I'm going to push it back into the head, so we can kind of push it back. A lot of sculpting is just kind of making small gradual tweaks as things go on and kind of improving it. So again, we'll notice that there's a bit more kind of curvature at the base of the nose as it kind of meets the head. So we can kind of, again, pull this out. So good to kind of maybe pull it out from different angles. something like that. And then again, a bigger move brush to make that all smaller. So now we can start to see a nose is kind of forming. Again, it's really important to try and capture these plane changes. So you'll notice, again, the nostril kind of comes around. So we can have this coming again down and around. So the idea that it does obviously come round, up and around like that. But the ball of the nose or the ball of the nostril, again, is also cartilage. But again, you can see it's kind of distinctive in two parts. The sense that, again, it'll kind of come here and go down towards there. So we can, again, kind of block that in and then smooth it. When we're in this kind of earlier stage, in this lower resolution, again, you've got to be careful not to over smooth, because obviously you can just smooth it back to nothing. So you're using smooth relatively sparingly. As we're sculpting this, by the way, I'm using perspective. Again, we can use orthographic to line things up, but generally we'll want to kind of check it in perspective. So I think maybe the angle at the moment is a little bit too much. So we can come with the move brush. I'm just going to push this up a bit. And then I'm just going to work on pulling the septum down, just so we have that kind of transition into the lower head, or into the lips. So then we have that kind of transition. As you sculpt, again, check from every angle, just because obviously changes you make in one angle will affect the other angles, and it's important that we kind of keep on top of that. I like to come in with the damn standard brush every now and then, just to, again, you've got to be a little bit light-handed with this. You don't want to carve too much. So obviously we can kind of start to, clearly define these kind of lines and these plane changes, but you don't want to go too much. And then obviously it'll kind of come down to the side of the heads there. But obviously, as we said, we're just kind of working on the nose at the moment. Again, the nostril's got some height to it, so you can see there is quite, it's relatively tall. So you might want to just use a move brush just to, again, pull this up and give it some height, some definition. So this is working pretty nicely. Again, maybe a little bit of smoothing. And again, just checking our nose profile. So it's a little bit, maybe a little bit uneven at the moment. So again, we can kind of just, using a smaller brush, just look to round things off. Again, we can pull this back to, again, ensure a nicer kind of smooth connection with the head. And we do have a bit of a tapering kind of there, so we can kind of capture that shape. Again, make sure the nostrils don't take up too much of the space. Again, I might just finesse the septum as well. Lovely, so you can start to see already we're kind of capturing something. The bridge of the nose is kind of getting a little bit lost. So sometimes, again, we can come in with, say, the damn standard and kind of trace up alongside it. And obviously just smooth it back a bit. Obviously you can pinch it as well, just to reinforce that shape. And obviously the nose profile we do have an angle as it obviously meets kind of the skull, and obviously it then goes up into kind of the glabella and the brow ridge. But obviously, as I said, for this tutorial, we're not necessarily going to worry about that one a bit too much. So again, I can just use my clay build-up brush just to kind of, again, start to kind of create some forms around the sides. So the idea that we do have obviously transition areas between the nose and obviously the face, and the rest of the face, I should say. Important to check your sculpt from every angle. So again, I think maybe the top angle, obviously we don't really have too much of a top look here. So again, it might just be that I want to kind of from the top, just again, create a bit more of a bit more of a taper into the nose there, and maybe just widen that out a bit. So we can kind of see, kind of getting something a little bit. Nice. Okay, so far I'm pretty happy with this. Maybe a little bit of kind of more curvature there, so kind of a bit more curved, so we're bringing in those nostrils, a little bit of inflate, just to, again, kind of beef up that sort of shape there. Again, a little bit of smooth, not too much, just a light touch. And I think we can probably start to look to increase some of this resolution. It might be that what we want to do is come with the flatten brush to start to define some of these planes. So the idea that we do have kind of two planes on the bottom side of the nose there, and obviously we can flatten the entire nose bridge a little bit, not too much. And then just tap smooth. So we can kind of get that there. I'm now going to increase to 64, so I'm going to go to Geometry, Dynamesh, I'm going to increase my resolution to 64, Control Drag, and now you can see we've got lots more resolution to work with. So this is where we can then kind of, again, using flatten, just really to define those kind of plane changes. So obviously if you're going for something stylized, you can keep them with a flat plane change, but if you're not, again, we can kind of obviously change that. Again, obviously as you flatten, you may lose some of those kind of details that we added earlier. So we're going to come with the move brush just to reintroduce that bump, as we mentioned earlier, for the nose bridge. Again, I'm going to try and create some more variation to the nose width there. Cool. Again, a little bit of smoothing, and again, we can use the clay build-up brush to kind of build up some of these kind of connections here. So the idea that, you know, there is kind of mass going upwards. Cool, so you can kind of see that there. Again, I'm just going to smooth out this bottom bit. You can add a filtrum as well, so I can just holding Alt and the clay build-up brush, we can just obviously add in the filtrum, which would go from the bottom of the septum down into the mouth. But we can just kind of start to, again, build that in just to get some rough shape. Again, I can obviously move that as well, just to tweak how that wants to look. Okay, so far this is looking quite nice. Again, we might just do a general bit of smoothing around our features that we've already made, because we maybe want to just kind of work on defining them a little bit. So again, a little bit of dam standard, just to kind of trace this nostril. Again, not too much, but we can then start to define that. Again, the idea that I'm going to use clay build-up to, again, try and define this part of the cartilage there. So the idea that we have these two planes here, and it comes, meets in the middle, and then obviously it kind of runs off in this direction. So again, maybe a bit of a smaller brush. So we have this kind of shape here. Obviously that's a bit excessive, again, and then we obviously have the nostril, as we said, kind of comes down, so make sure it actually comes down to the bottom. Up and around. At this stage, I'm going to come with the dam standard, just to, again, reintroduce the nostrils a bit. Obviously nostrils have depth, so they actually do kind of go back in towards the head, so you can breathe. Again, then we can come and just start to smooth some of these details. But you'll notice now how we can start to read those plane changes and those forms, which is really helping to kind of make this feel like a nose. And again, sometimes just a little bit of dam standard just to reiterate those. Again, maybe a little bit of inflate. Just like so. Again, maybe I want a little bit more roundness on the nose, so you could use clay build-up, or again, a little bit of inflate, because we call it the ball of the nose, so it should kind of be a little bit round. So again, light touches and light smoothing. So that's working quite nicely. As always, again, looking at your reference, so we do have maybe a little bit more kind of a nose that looks like that. And again, as always, just try and come back into bringing that transition between the skull and the cartilage. So again, just a bit of clay build-up, just to smooth that little bump in there. Again, it's a small, subtle bump. Okay, I'm quite happy with this. Again, maybe just using clay build-up just to kind of work on the transition areas here. Bit of smoothing. Again, the septum's feeling a little bit too large, so using a move brush, we can just come and taper that off a bit more. Again, maybe it's a bit too flat there, so the idea that it kind of does taper up more towards the head. So again, you can just use move brush just to kind of create that shape a little bit more. Again, just kind of work on maybe rounding off some of these nostrils. So smaller brush for a smaller change, so you can round it off. Again, pull that back. And I am going to just, again, try and use the flatten brush just to kind of define those plane changes a little bit. Not much, but you can now start to see how we can kind of start to read those plane changes there, which help shape the nose. Again, I'm going to use move here just to pull up the nostril. Again, just to work on that shape a bit more. So I'm going to use my kind of side references that I have here to kind of look at the sort of shape that we're getting. So it might be that we need to just kind of pull this down a bit on the bottom and a little bit on the top. Again, obviously make sure it's kind of got a roundness to it as well. So again, this is where we just check our sculpt from as many angles as possible. Again, using clay build-up, I'm also just going to try and define kind of this nose ridge a little bit more. So the idea that obviously that would kind of go off over there. And then again, we have a kind of a transitionary area here. So just smoothing some of these areas out a little bit. So there we can see that there. Because again, we can kind of see there and then it transitions. So the idea that the transition will kind of happen here, then we kind of get a little bit of a flap. So let's just take away some mass there and then just kind of smooth that out. Again, it might be that you obviously have, as we said, a nose profile. So the idea that this kind of comes in, obviously this will then kind of come outwards a bit more. So we can obviously, like I said, just get that in for now, but this would be something, that angle would be something that you would achieve as you sculpt the full head. And obviously we do have a video that brings all of these different facial features together in a final form factor. But for now we can just kind of block that in. But as you can see, so far I'm pretty happy with this. There's not really, again, we've got most of what we need here. And again, and our mesh is only under 10,000 points. So my point is that you have a lot of flexibility here. Again, it might just be that we want to kind of round off the nose a little bit more. So again, just make it a little bit smaller. But we can see that we have something working here. And then again, I'm just going to use the move brush just to work on the kind of the transitionary areas. Maybe pull this down just a tad. Again, just to work on that transition between the septum and obviously the philtrum. Again, looking at our kind of reference, so it's maybe a little bit more of an angle, so we can have it a bit more curved. And that's obviously a little bit more rounded. Again. Even if you're doing something stylized, you're still going to have it rooted in realism. So the idea that we'll still have this here, and then obviously it's just going to be a case of exaggerating or simplifying the plane changes or the proportions, but the plane changes will still be present. So you're still going to have the same kind of form and structure. It's just going to be a little bit more, exaggerated or highlighted, I should say. So the idea that you can come in with a flattened brush to obviously, highlight this plane change, and then obviously highlight this plane change, and then, these ones, if you wanted to kind of go for something very stylized, so then you can start to see how, through that we can kind of get a stylized nose, essentially. But obviously, I'm kind of going for a little bit more realistic. Again, I think I'm just going to work on the general kind of width, use the right brush. So again, just using my move brush, quite a large one, just to kind of push the nose a little bit thinner, just so it doesn't kind of take up too much space. Again, I recommend, as you're learning to sculpt or learning to sculpt noses or faces or anything like that, look to do many examples of these. Obviously this is one nose, but I'd recommend, spending however long on one nose and then transitioning to do another nose of someone else. Again, looking at real noses from real life, whether those are celebrities or whether those are famous people or whether they're your family or your friends. Again, use what you have available to you. Again, borrowing from real life and looking at real life is just going to make you a better sculptor and, more importantly, a better artist. So really a lot of sculpting is just the kind of art of observation. So the idea, at the moment you can see my nose is a bit too flat and we definitely have a little bit more of a square nose. So the idea that let's kind of square this off a bit. Again, and then the idea that's just round this off, just so we get kind of a nice shape. And again, I want that a little bit rounder at the base. I'm just going to pull that back as well. So again, the idea, it kind of transitions into the head. And just going to round off this top bit. Again, you can use the damp sander just to kind of come in with that a little bit, not much, just a bit. Okay. So yeah, I'm just going to use clay build-up just to kind of try and define some of these planes on the side a little bit more, but I think we're pretty much almost there. So again, might just be worth coming with a damn standard. Just to, again, sometimes I like to come in and just exaggerate or emphasize the nose bridge there. But again, we've got our kind of all of our kind of plane changes. Again, sometimes we can just come in and reiterate those a little bit, just a tad. Again, looking at our kind of reference. Again, a bit of smoothing. Okay. Again, maybe just gonna, using the move brush, just squaring it off a little bit more. So just squaring off the tip of the nose a little bit. And again, I'm just gonna maybe pull this into the sides, just to kind of flatten off those sides there. And then last but not least, just building up this kind of side mass, or obviously kind of transitions. Again, just moving that there. And again, just kind of removing that bit there. Obviously that's where kind of maybe the eye and so forth would kind of go. And this is kind of the main transition area. Cool, and just coming along the side, just moving that. And I think we're pretty much there. So, not necessarily part of the tutorial, but the way I'm going to finalize is I'm going to just using Control Shift, using the knife curve tool, just to tidy this up so we can kind of just remove the sides. Let's do this with graphic. So, nice and easy cuts. Cut down the middle just to kind of get a nice, clean end result. Last thing I'm going to do after we've cut it is I'm just going to, again, just narrow off some of these nostrils a little bit. So we can just, again, using our move brush, just push them in a little bit. Not too much, just to thin off the nose. And then just for presentation purposes, we can increase the resolution to 128. And again, just do a little bit of smoothing, not too much, so just tapping smooth kind of around. And again, it might just be that now we can kind of come in here and better define the nostrils a little bit. So using the damn standard brush, just to, again, kind of create those shapes. Again, just round that off a little bit, smooth it off. Again, the idea that, again, the nostrils should kind of go back in towards the head. So they do have depth to them, the nostrils. We shouldn't really see where they end. So obviously that could be something that you would kind of carry on sculpting. So I might use the clay build-up just to kind of get in there. But we can build up that shape. Okay, there we go. Just taper off again, tapering off the septum there, just to kind of get that shape for us. Again. And there we go. We have our nose. Again, might just be worth just again redefining some of our kind of shapes, so our nose bridges, again, just to ensure that we kind of keep that a little bit. Again, sometimes the forms can get a little bit lost, so sometimes worth just kind of revisiting them when you increase your resolution, just to ensure that they stay as we want them to stay. Okay, so just one more check through every angle. A little bit of smoothing every now and then. Again, might just, there we go. Again, checking for thickness, making sure everything feels kind of thick. I might just, again, pull back the nostril with the move brush a little bit, just push that back. Again, in line with our kind of reference. Again, check it from the sides. We can maybe just kind of refine that nostril shape a little bit. But I'm feeling that's pretty Pretty happy with that. So there we have our nose. A simple way of taking a simple object, looking at references, breaking down the plane changes, breaking down the forms, working from a low resolution to a high resolution, working with brush economy to build our nose here. If you found this tutorial useful, be sure to check out our other tutorials about sculpting facial features, such as the eyes, ears, and the mouth, and combining all of them together to sculpt a head. But see you soon, and carry on sculpting.